Now, chapter 1 of our story, creation, it starts in the book of Genesis. Now, the title, the book of Genesis, comes from the Greek biblos geneseos. Biblos simply means book. Geneseos means Genesis. Now, Genesis can mean genealogy or generations. The phrase first appears in Genesis 2:4 when we're told of the very beginning of the genealogy, or the generations of the human race. Now, Genesis 1 starts by saying, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." He created the entire cosmos. Then verse 2 goes on to say, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep." And then, and this is the part we really want to pay attention to, so are you ready? "And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." Now, there is imagery here we want to pay attention to. First, we have the Spirit of God. Now, spirit in the Hebrew is pronounced ruach. And in addition to meaning spirit, it can mean breath or wind. And now the Spirit is hovering. This is avian language. It's a bird terminology. It's that of a bird flying. The Hebrews would liken it to a dove flying across the sky. So we have this dove imagery. And now the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. And then in verse 3, we hear, Vayomer Elohim, and God said. And now we have the voice of God. Now when this imagery comes together and all shows up, God is up to something. He's up to something big. Here he is creating and fashioning the earth as we know it. God goes on to create male and female in his own image. He breathes into them the breath of life, puts them in the Garden of Eden, and he blesses them and says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and have dominion." Basically, God is saying, expand the borders of the Garden of Eden to the ends of the earth. And as you do, reflect my image, my character, and my attributes, and everything to which you put your hand. And 6 times we read that creation is good. And the 7th time we read that creation is very good. Now, 7 is the number of wholeness in Hebrew. And there is this wholeness, or what the Hebrew people would call shalom. And it comes from there being a harmony in relationships. Relationship between God and man, in human relationships, and even mankind's relationship with the creation and animals. So there's a sense of wholeness and peace and shalom in Genesis 1 and 2. And now we get into chapter 2 of our big story, the spread of sin. It's where things get messed up. This covers Genesis 3 through 11. The humans rebel against God, and that shalom of Genesis 1 and 2, the harmony, it's fractured and it's lost. Because of the rebellion, sin, chaos, death, frustration, brokenness, it enters the story. And because of the rebellion, the human heart becomes infected with an illness, where we naturally stand opposed to God's will, his will for our lives. We hurt each other. We don't do a good job of taking care of creation. And this infection of the human heart, it gets passed down from parents to their children, from generation to generation, until finally in Genesis 6, the world is filled with violence and oppression. But God didn't create the world to be that way. So he steps in and he sends a flood. And God saves one family, the family of Noah, and he saves animals. Now pay attention again to the imagery. In Genesis 7, God sends a flood. So again now, we have this imagery of water, just like the earth was filled with water in Genesis. And then God makes the rain stop, and he sends a wind. In 8:1, we read that God sends a wind, and he blows it over the earth to dry it. Now remember, our word for wind was ruach, the same word that we saw for spirit. Then as the wind is blowing, Noah sends out a dove to check for the dry land. And then when the dry land appears, just like it did in Genesis 1, Noah and his family, they get off the voice, and guess what they hear? The voice of God. And God says to Noah and his sons the same thing he said to the couple in the garden. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Now, do you remember what we said when we saw this imagery? We said that God is up to something big. In Genesis 1, he was creating. Here, God is recreating and giving a fresh start to his creation. And he gives them the same command as Genesis 1 and 2. See, God hasn't given up on his plan for creation and the good creation of Genesis 1 and 2. That's why we see the same imagery showing up here as we did in Genesis 1. But again, there's a problem with the human heart, and people still rebel. And in Genesis 11, it has gotten so bad that all the nations of the earth are rebelling against God, so that God has to scatter them and confuse their languages. And we wonder, surely this time God has given up. But he doesn't give up. He has a solution. And now that takes us to chapter 3 of our story. So now we're in chapter 3 of our story, Israel. Now God calls one man Abraham, and he makes 3 big promises to him. He says, I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to turn you into a great people, a great nation. And I'm going to bless you to bless all the nations of the world. Now this is God's answer to reversing the sin of Genesis 3 through 11 and getting back to the good of Genesis 1 and 2. Now here's how it plays out. Abraham and his wife Sarah give birth to Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah give birth to Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, which become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, because of a famine, the Israelites end up in Egypt. Eventually, they are fruitful and multiply, and they grow into a great nation, just like God promised. But Pharaoh and the Egyptians are intimidated by the Israelites, so they oppress them. So much so that Pharaoh orders the killing of the male children. Now, the Israelites cry out, and God is faithful to answer and raises up a leader to save them from the Egyptians. His name is Moses. So God sends 10 plagues on the Egyptians, and he leads the Israelites to the waters of the Red Sea. He then takes them out into the desert to get tested. And then he takes them to a mountain, to Mount Sinai, and he gives them the law, which includes the 10 commandments. And here's God's plan. God says, I'm going to teach you now how to live, and I'm going to give you the land I promised to Abraham, the land of Canaan. And back then, Canaan was the center of the world. It's where everyone traveled through. So God is essentially saying to the Israelites, if you trust me, and if you live how I say, the nations will see you and your way of life, and it will be so attractive that they will want to know about your God. And as you tell them about me, then they will come to know the one true God of the world, and we'll get back to the good of Genesis 1 and 2. But this doesn't work out so well. There's still a problem with the human heart. The Israelites, they get into the land, and they can't even get along. So they divide into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is bad news bears. They're disobedient, so God kicks them out of the land. The southern kingdom isn't much better, so God eventually kicks them out of the land too. So now, the nation that was supposed to be the hope of the world is living in exile. And that ends chapter 3 of our big story. So now to chapter 4. It's the 400 years of waiting. This covers the periods between our Old Testament and when our New Testament begins. During this time, the Israelites slowly return to their land, but they aren't in control of it. Rome is. And the Israelites are still waiting for God to speak and to act, but he's silent. And we're again left wondering, what happened to God's good plan for creation back in Genesis 1 and 2? Has God finally given up? And now begins the New Testament and chapter 5 of our story, the story of Jesus. And the answer is emphatically no, God has not given up. Matthew 1:1, when we read it, it begins by saying, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Guess what the Greek is there? Biblos Geneseos. We could read Matthew 1:1 as the book of Genesis. It's the new Genesis, the book of new beginnings, the beginning of the renewed human race and generations, and it all starts now with Jesus. And listen to how Matthew presents the early years of Jesus' history. First, there is a threat against Jesus' life, so he's taken into Egypt. Then the evil King Herod is intimidated by the news of Jesus' birth, so he orders the killing of the male children. Jesus is then brought out of Egypt. Then he goes through the waters of baptism. He's taken out into the desert to be tested. Only unlike Israel, he remains faithful. And then he goes to a mountain in Matthew 5:1. Only he doesn't go there to receive the law like Israel and Moses. He gives the law and shows that he has the authority of God himself. Now look at the history of Israel compared to the history of Jesus. I mean, they're almost identical. Why? What is Matthew telling us? I think he's saying, even though Israel failed, God didn't give up on his plan of saving the world through Israel. Only now it's happening through Jesus, who is taking Israel's mission upon his own shoulders. He's going to be the one who is the hope of the nations. And then remember our imagery from Genesis? Listen to what happens when Jesus is baptized. And when Jesus was baptized, he goes into the waters. So we have this imagery again of water. And then the heavens open up and the Spirit descends. Remember we said our word for Spirit is ruach? And it descends like a dove. And then we hear the very voice of God saying, "This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." Now remember what we said when we see this imagery, that God is up to something big? He's up to something big again. He's renewing his creation to get it back to the good of Genesis 1 and 2. But now, it's happening through Jesus. And he invites us to partner with him in carrying out Israel's mission. Only God's people aren't called Israelites anymore, because they are made up of every tribe, tongue, and nation. So now God's people are called the church. The church is the new Israel, and that gets us to chapter 6. This is the chapter that you and I live in. See, after Jesus' sacrificial death to cover all the sins ever since Genesis 3, and after his physical bodily resurrection from the dead, guess what is one of the first things Jesus says to his disciples? In John 20, he says, "Shalom, peace. I have come so you can have the harmony that existed back in Genesis 1 and 2. And then guess what happens? He breathes on them the breath of life, the spirit of life. Because remember that problem of the human heart that has been plaguing the story? Jesus takes care of it. He gives the church his spirit, and he renews the hearts of his people and empowers them to follow him and carry out his mission, which has remained the same, the healing of the nations and the renewal of creation. And notice what happens when Jesus pours out his spirit on his people in the beginning of the book of Acts. The nations begin to understand each other and work together as one people, as the one church. And it's the great reversal of when God scattered the nations and confused their languages back in Genesis 11. And the church is called to partner with God to carry the story forward towards chapter 7, the new creation. See, the final chapter doesn't end with heaven and people floating around like spirits. When you read the last two chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, they echo Genesis 1 and 2. And they talk about a return of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of the dead, and the renewal of the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth of Genesis 1:1 that God has remained committed to throughout the entire story. And I love what one scholar says. God doesn't create junk, and he's not junking what he created. He stays committed to it. And as the biblical theologian Christopher Wright says in describing the new heavens and the new earth, he says the new creation will not be a blank page, as if God will simply crumble up the whole of human historical life in this creation and toss it in the cosmic rubbish bin and then hand us a new sheet to start all over again. The new creation will start with the unimaginable reservoir of all that human civilization has accomplished in the old creation, but purged, cleansed, disinfected, sanctified, and blessed. And we will have an eternity to enjoy it and to build upon it in ways we cannot dream of now, as we will exercise the powers of creativity of our redeemed humanity. How good does that sound? But we're not there yet. Until that day, living in chapter 6, you and I are called to play a part in the story, bringing about the healing of the nations and the redemption in every arena of life. So young men and women, this means we need guys and gals who are open to having their hearts and minds renewed by the Spirit of God, who enter every arena of life to bring God's healing and redemption. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, engineers, politicians, committed moms and dads raising families, law enforcement, artists, botanists, everything you can think of. Because God is restoring all of creation that he declared good. This is your divine calling. May you play your unique part in the story, and may you play it well.